So something really strange happened to me last week. I was grabbing coffee with a friend, and she works as an HR consultant for some, really big firms. Okay. And for almost an hour, she was talking with this, I can only describe it as an intense, almost religious fervor about moral hygiene in the workplace.
Moral hygiene?
Yeah. She was describing all these new protocols for inclusive language, these purity tests for corporate speech, and she had the solemnity of a high priestess. Mm-hmm. To her, a single misplaced word wasn't just, a mistake.
It was a sin.
It was a heresy. It required like an immediate public confession or you'd get professionally excommunicated. Yeah. She was totally convinced these rigid rituals were the only thing holding society together.
Yeah, the public performance of virtue.
Exactly. But then the conversation took this really sharp, uncomfortable turn. I asked her how her teenage son was doing, and her whole expression just changed. It went from moral authority to this hollow, exhausted resignation. She said, almost in passing, that he's been struggling to connect. He's spending almost all his time behind a locked door with a smartphone. Mm-hmm. So I asked her, are you worried about what he's consuming? I mean, the average kid sees hardcore explicit content by age 11 now. And she just shrugged. She said, it's his private business.
Wow.
We don't judge personal desires in this house. As long as he's consenting to the screen, who am I to step in? And that pivot, it just stunned me.
I can imagine.
In public, a zealot for the smallest details of language. In private, a complete libertarian while her own son is being eroded by this digital tide. And it made me realize these two things aren't opposites.
No, they're not.
The dogmatic secular religion and the saturation of pornography, they're mirror images of the same collapse. We police speech like the Inquisition, but we treat the most corrosive habits as these untouchable private rights.
And that anecdote just perfectly captures the profound ethical contradiction at the heart of the modern world. You saw someone experiencing a form of structural schizophrenia.
Yes, that's exactly it.
Hyper-moralized in public, fixated on these purity tests, and yet completely devoid of constraints in the private sphere. Yeah. That total lack of restraint on these corrosive digital habits, it creates anxious, isolated individuals.
Who then look for salvation somewhere else.
Exactly. They seek belonging and moral certainty by joining these highly tribal, secularized moral crusades. The two symptoms, the dogmatic zealotry and the total private decay, they're what our sources describe as mirror manifestations of a deep societal collapse.
So that sets a powerful stage for our mission today. We need to move from that ethical contradiction you just described to the quantifiable structures underneath it all.
Right.
We need to systematically examine this collapse by diving into three intertwined phenomena.
Precisely. First, we have to understand the broken foundation. We'll use the sociological concept of anomie, the destruction of shared norms. Mm-hmm. Second, we'll analyze the rise of this successor ideology in the public sphere, which, steps in to fill that moral vacuum.
And third,
we have to quantify the private erosion. How these frictionless digital habits are collapsing foundational institutions like marriage, creating the very atomized individuals who are so susceptible to this public zealotry in the first place.
Okay, let's start there with the broken foundation. To really get what we're experiencing, we have to go all the way back to the 19th century, to Emil Durkheim, to define anomie.
Anomie is absolutely the core concept here. It comes from the Greek anomia, which literally means lack of law or regulation.
Right.
And Durkheim defined it in his 1897 work, Suicide. And it's not about, personal immorality. He saw it as a severe structural condition.
What did he call it?
A state of normlessness and instability caused by the sudden collapse of social norms and the resulting lack of individual behavior guidance.
That phrase, sudden collapse, feels really key. He wasn't talking about a slow moral drift, was he? He was talking about a fracture.
A total fracture caused by rapid disruptive change. He was observing the unprecedented structural transformation of 19th century Europe. You had rapid industrialization.
People moving to cities.
Massive urbanization, the rise of secular thought. He described society moving from what he called mechanical solidarity.
Which is solidarity based on similarity, right? Everyone in the village does the same thing, believes the same thing.
Exactly. To what he called organic solidarity, which is based on functional complementarity. Specialized individuals who all rely on each other in a complex system like a modern city.
So when the farmer moves to the city to work in a factory, he just loses that whole moral ecosystem that used to govern his life.
He loses everything. And that period between the collapse of the old systems and the formation of new functional ones, That is the normative vacuum period, the traditional guardrails, the church, the tight-knit family, the shared cultural stories. They're all destroyed by the liquid forces of the market and the city.
The collective consciousness loses certainty. People suddenly have no idea what to hope for, what their duties are, what success even looks like anymore.
And he proved this wasn't just a theory. He looked at the most tragic statistic he could find: suicide rates.
And his finding was incredible. He showed that suicide rates didn't just track with economic poverty, which you'd think would be the cause.
Right, you think it's a material cause. But instead, the rates rose significantly during economic crises. And this is the key: both booms and busts.
Both. That's fascinating.
Yes, and this suggested the cause was the sudden failure of social regulatory mechanisms. When your expectations are suddenly limitless during a boom or suddenly non-existent during a bust, the regulating effect of society just vanishes. And individuals, lacking that mooring, become susceptible to self-destruction.
Okay, so that establishes the classical foundation. But this concept, just like society, had to evolve. Robert Merton comes along decades later, 1938, and he takes Anomie in a new direction.
He does. He introduces this idea of structural tension. And this is a huge shift. It moves the focus from a lack of norms to a conflict between norms.
And Merton's revision is so crucial for understanding our world today. He argued that anomie isn't just from a vacuum, but from this systemic tension between two competing forces.
The first being the culturally prescribed goals society tells you to want, great wealth, high status.
And the second being the institutionally recognized legitimate ways you're supposed to get them. A good education, working hard, playing by the rules.
Exactly. So society tells you achieve success, but then it blocks or restricts the channels for actually achieving that success legitimately. And this pressure, this strain, creates a powerful drive toward deviant, or what he called innovative behavior.
I see. So it's the discrepancy between the promise and the reality that creates the problem.
Absolutely. It creates this strain, and that leads to his 5 modes of adaptation. One of them is innovation, where you accept the cultural goal, like wealth, but you reject or you just bypass the legitimate means to get there.
And that framework lets us see this structural tension everywhere in contemporary life.
Far beyond the factory floor. You see it acutely in these hyper-competitive systems, like elite education.
Right.
Take the Chinese educational system. There was a study that focused on what's called 985 elitism.
For anyone who doesn't know, the 985 Project is the name for China's absolute top tier of universities.
That's right. And getting into one is universally seen as the essential cultural goal. It's considered the only real path to a secure, high-status life. But the channels to get there, the number of spots, are incredibly limited. It creates this massive structural scarcity.
So you have a universal goal, but the means are severely restricted. What was the result?
The study found this limitation dramatically increased what they called innovative anomie, which is just a sociological term for deviant behavior. Cheating, corruption, using illicit advantages. Specifically, it increased by 2.3 times among students who are repeat test takers, the group that's most constrained and, frankly, most desperate within that system.
They've accepted the goal of success, but the system has driven them to reject the legitimate means.
Precisely. And this maps perfectly onto our platform economy, too. It's all governed by these invisible algorithmic demands that often conflict with our social norms.
You mean digital Taylorism?
That's the term. Traditional Taylorism tried to optimize the human body. Digital Taylorism optimizes the digital workflow. An algorithm sets an impossible goal, like a 3-minute delivery target for a driver.
Or a content creator needing 10 viral videos a week.
Yes. And those targets are in direct conflict with social norms, like obeying traffic laws or maintaining your mental health, or even just producing thoughtful, high-quality content. The algorithm systematically promotes deviant behavior by setting a conflict between technical deficiency and social rules.
I want to pause here for a second because we need to explore what happens when this industrial and structural anomie hits the digital age. The problem isn't just a lack of norms anymore. It's a tsunami of data and connection that just overwhelms our capacity to process it morally.
This is the critical transition to digital anomie. The philosopher Luciano Floridi, he termed the core problem information entropy.
Information entropy.
He argued that when the sheer volume of data exceeds an individual's cognitive processing capacity, complex moral judgments just aren't sustainable anymore. Our moral compass simplifies. It reduces all that complexity down to rapid emotional reactions.
And we now have actual scientific evidence that shows this shift happening in the brain. It's a physical explanation for why we default to outrage online.
That's right. fMRI studies have given us a physical basis for this cognitive overload. Researchers monitored brain activity while subjects were faced with information saturation.
And the results were stark.
They were. The activation of the prefrontal cortex, that's the area for complex moral deliberation, cost-benefit analysis, delayed gratification, it decreased by 40%.
40%.
At the same time, activity in the amygdala, the brain's emotional center for fear, fight, or flight, it increased significantly.
So what we've established is that the internet doesn't just show us bad things. It actually changes the way our brain processes morality. It pushes us toward emotion and away from reason simply because of the volume and speed of the data.
Exactly. The brain just defaults to rapid emotional triage when it's overwhelmed. And that explains the pervasive moral indifference, the simplified outrage, the binary thinking that's so common in digital public life.
Which brings us to the very mechanisms of digital life that accelerate this collapse. The sociologist Zygmunt Bauman called it liquid modernity.
Bauman's framework is perfect here. He posits that the solid constraints of traditional moral norms, things like loyalty, place, commitment, are deconstructed by the liquid forces of contemporary life.
Algorithms, personalized feeds, virtual identities.
Right, and we can really detail 4 mechanisms that drive this digital anomie.
Okay, break them down for us.
First, you have moral narrowing. This is driven by personalized recommendations. Algorithms are designed to maximize engagement, and they do that by feeding you content that aligns with your existing beliefs and emotional triggers.
The filter bubble.
Exactly. Social media creates these filter bubbles that trap users in a single reinforcing value judgment. One study found that personalized recommendations reduce the probability of users being exposed to different opinions by a staggering 62%.
Wow.
That narrowing of perspective systematically simplifies complex moral problems into these binary adversarial oppositions.
So the echo chamber doesn't just reinforce your beliefs, it chemically simplifies the entire moral landscape.
Yeah.
So what happens when people shed their real-world identity online?
Well, that leads right to the second mechanism, the exemption effect of virtual identity. Anonymity in places like the metaverse or online forums, it radically reduces moral constraints because the cost of transgression is basically zero.
Right, there's no cost.
None. Research from Meta found that the incidence of unethical behavior in virtual environments is 2.3 times higher than in the real world. And get this, anonymous users were 3.2 times more likely to post hate speech than users with real names. The perceived lack of consequence in that virtual space acts as a moral release valve.
And then there's the speed, which we touched on. Moral deliberation is a slow, thoughtful process. The internet is built for speed.
That is the erosion by speed. Short video platforms, fast-paced feeds, they compress the time you have for a moral decision down to less than 3 seconds.
Less than 3 seconds.
Which dramatically increases impulsive reactions and reduces any thoughtful, sustained engagement. When a moral controversy erupts, it peaks in outrage very quickly, and then it disappears just as fast. Studies on platforms like Weibo found the average duration of a moral hotspot was just 11.3 days.
It creates a cheap morality of just click to participate.
It's performative, unsustainable, and ultimately meaningless moral action. 73% of moral condemnation tweets have no follow-up action within 24 hours. It's outrage without effort.
And the final mechanism, moral unloading. This one feels like the most concerning because it's a delegation of conscience.
It is. Moral unloading happens because of cognitive exhaustion. The data overload, the sheer effort of moral reasoning is just too taxing. So individuals outsource their moral judgments to algorithms.
What do you mean?
They trust the platform's moderation rules or its recommended content to be their ethical guide. Studies show this leads to a 37% decrease in their own ethical sensitivity. We are quite literally asking code to manage our conscience. And that is the final surrender to digital anomie.
So anomie creates a vacuum of norms. Liquid modernity, driven by speed and anonymity, is making people anxious, isolated, emotionally charged. And this massive moral vacuum, it doesn't stay neutral, does it? It gets filled.
It gets filled by something new, something rigid.
Which brings us to section 2.
When a culture loses its thick moral vocabulary, the shared language around big values like sex, duty, family, transcendent purpose,
Yeah.
it doesn't just become some secular neutral space.
Right.
Instead, society reorganizes its moral life. A secular state religion rises in God's place. It offers a functional substitute for those lost communal guardrails, and it provides a necessary sense of belonging and moral purpose to all those atomized individuals.
And our sources refer to this new movement as the successor ideology. That term seems to carry a lot of weight.
It does. The term was coined by Wesley Yang and then popularized by people like Ross Douthat, and it describes this melange of academic radicalism that has moved out of the university and is now seeking and achieving hegemony across all major American institutions.
Corporate HR, media, academia, government.
Everywhere. Douthat specifically framed this movement as the successor to the cultural role that was once played by mainline Protestantism in defining the moral life of the nation. It's a direct ideological replacement.
And what's really striking isn't just the content of this new framework, but its structure and its function. It operates like a fully formed religion, even without a god.
That's because it fulfills the exact same deep human psychological needs. The need for moral meaning, for belonging, for group distinction, and for a path to atonement. It has non-negotiable dogmas, rigid taboos, formalized rituals,
Purity tests,
strict purity tests, demands for public confessions, and critically severe punishments. The excommunication we now call cancellation. Dissent isn't just disagreement, it's heresy. It's a moral contamination that has to be purged to keep the social body pure.
And this structure follows an almost liturgical pattern of sin and salvation, all centered around identifying who is good and who is bad.
The structure is ancient. The framework always involves three components. First, you identify an irredeemably stained group, often defined by historical identity markers like race or gender. Second, you identify an innocent victim group whose porcelain fragility must never be shattered, as one source put it. And third, you demand a purged scapegoat to ritually cleanse the social body. It is a political liturgy focused entirely on managing sin and transgression.
This completely shifts the central currency of the moral system. In the old system, you had a vertical debt, but here it's all horizontal.
That distinction is paramount. Traditional Christian systems involved a vertical debt, an unpayable debt you owed to God, which required a transcendent figure, Christ, as the ultimate scapegoat to clear the books.
Right.
The successor ideology replaces that with a perpetual horizontal debt and payment system. Guilt is permanent, it's inherited, and it's owed by the irredeemables to the innocents.
Which means innocent signaling becomes the necessary liturgical practice.
Exactly. What people often call virtue signaling is better understood in this context as innocent signaling. Displaying support for movements like DEI or Black Lives Matter, adhering to these strict linguistic rules, participating in public apologies.
It's all an act to show that social death cancellation should pass over you, not your neighbor.
It is a continuous public declaration of alignment and purity.
This tension explains why we're seeing competence, merit, even objective reality just take a backseat to moral alignment. We're moving away from the politics of competence.
Historically, whether you look at the founders' vision of citizen competence or the progressives' vision of expert competence, the focus was always on ability, on results, efficiency, rigorous data.
Right.
This new regime, rooted in the successor ideology, is based entirely on the politics of innocence and transgression. Competence becomes secondary to and often in direct conflict with moral alignment.
And the most tangible consequence of that is how core liberal values, like free speech, are treated now. They're like these inconvenient relics.
Well, in a politics of competence, speech is valued because it's supposed to reveal facts and refine arguments to get to the best outcomes.
Sure.
But in a politics of innocence, the effect of speech is judged only by whether it affirms the innocent victim group or causes them harm. So if a statement, regardless of its factual accuracy, is judged to inflict emotional damage or shatter that porcelain fragility of the innocent, it's deemed immoral and has to be constrained.
So free speech becomes an irksome archaism that just complicates the moral mission.
Precisely. And this ideological transition leads to this widespread feeling of institutional betrayal, particularly among people who dedicated their lives to that old meritocratic contract.
This is the structural collapse of meritocracy in real time.
It is. Elite institutions, academia, major media, publishing houses, they are actively dispensing with traditional standards of merit. The criteria for success, whether it's getting tenure or winning a grant, it's shifting away from the strongest argument or the most rigorous data toward explicit, total alignment with the new moral orthodoxy.
It's that feeling of political exile that so many classical liberal and moderate conservative intellectuals are describing. The rules of the game just changed mid-play.
Think about the example of the retired professor, Dr. Eris. He spent 40 years evaluating tenure decisions based on peer-reviewed rigor and scholarly contribution.
Oh, career.
Right. And in the last 5 years of his career, he witnessed brilliant young researchers passed over because, while their work was academically excellent, their research topic or their conclusions didn't sufficiently align with the new institutional values. The criteria for success were now identity and ideology, not academic excellence.
The competence vacuum we see in public life is a direct result of that shift.
It's a closed system. And the people at the top of these institutions, they aren't suffering the consequences of this shift. They are often the beneficiaries. Which leads us directly to the concept of luxury beliefs.
Luxury beliefs. This concept is designed to highlight the hypocrisy inherent in this new moral orthodoxy.
Yes, they're defined as ideas and opinions that confer high status on the upper class. Typically those from elite educational backgrounds, at very little personal cost to them, while at the same time imposing substantial, often hidden costs on the lower classes who lack that insulation.
So the elites can afford the moral posturing because they're insulated from the real-world fallout.
Geographically, financially, socially. And you see this profound, acute hypocrisy, particularly in the tech sector, which produces the liquid, fragmenting forces we were just talking about.
Right.
Tech tycoons publicly encourage the use of addictive digital devices, advocating for total digital freedom. Yet, privately, they enforce these rigid, almost puritanical rules about technology use in their own homes.
The ultimate example being Steve Jobs. The man who created the iPad famously prohibited his own children from using it.
That is the textbook definition of a luxury belief in action. The elite promotes a lifestyle for the public frictionless digital saturation, total immersion in this liquid modernity of the screen that they know from their own proximity to the tech is harmful and corrosive to formation, to attention, to connection.
But they leverage their status and wealth to afford the restraint they publicly disregard.
They don't get high on their own supply.
So, the moral vacuum of Anomie gets filled by a successor ideology that provides meaning through moral theater and scapegoating. But the whole system relies on the hypocrisy of the elites. And that structural hypocrisy brings us back to the personal, atomized reality of people living the consequences of this frictionless world.
And this transition is crucial. The public hyper-moralization and the private atomization are fundamentally linked. We now have to turn to the quantifiable erosion that creates the isolated, anxious individual who is just ripe for the moral zealotry of political sectarianism.
We have to revisit that opening scenario then. The HR consultant's zealotry for corporate purity tests, and how that contrasts so sharply with her refusal to constrain her son's digital habits. The public sphere is rigid, the private sphere is liquid, and this paradox is creating deep structural damage.
The sources refer to this as the privatization and non-judgment of desire, even when that desire leads to these corrosive, isolating, and ultimately addictive habits. The systemic erosion happens from the inside out, and it often hits the family unit first.
We have to look at the experience of people actually living this. We discussed a man named Julian from Seattle, whose experience perfectly illustrates how easy access just erodes the effort required for real connection.
Julian's story is a profound illustration of digital enemy hitting the home. He described a life where the default setting was just frictionless digital consumption, easy access to instant intimacy and emotional release on a screen.
Right.
And that experience systematically lowered his tolerance for the difficulty and effort inherent in real human trust, vulnerability, and the sustained commitment required in his marriage.
The screen was just easier.
So much easier. It provided easy dopamine, instant gratification. And that made the messiness of his real-life relationships feel exhausting and just unnecessary by comparison. His private indulgence was creating Durkheimian anomie in his home, a breakdown of the implicit shared norms needed for a functioning mutual life. This trait of deep bonds for easy dopamine is the engine of societal collapse.
This moves the conversation from abstract theory to real structural consequences. What does the longitudinal data tell us about the link between this pervasive, frictionless consumption, particularly pornography, and foundational institutions like marriage?
The data comes from the General Social Survey panel studies. They span nearly a decade, from 2006 to 2014. And the study was specifically designed to isolate the association between the initiation of pornography use and subsequent divorce.
While controlling for everything else.
Right, controlling for a host of other variables like income, education, and even prior happiness.
And what was the core structural finding on the probability of divorce?
The finding was sobering. Beginning pornography use, and this was defined simply as watching an X-rated movie between survey waves. It roughly doubles the predicted probability of divorce for married Americans.
Doubles it.
The odds ratio calculated in the study was 2.20. To put that in perspective, this is a massive external variable impacting the stability of one of society's most fundamental institutions.
Doubling the risk is huge. Let's talk about the gender differences, because the common assumption might be that this effect is predominantly male-driven.
The association between beginning use and divorce did hold significantly for both men and women. But the interesting nuance came out when researchers looked at discontinuing use.
So stopping.
Right. Discontinuing consumption was associated with a lower probability of divorce. But, and this is the interesting part, this positive effect was only significant for women. Women who quit porn saw their likelihood of divorce decline by 2/3.
That is genuinely counterintuitive. If men are the heavier users, why wouldn't their stopping the habit be more predictive of marital stability?
The analysis suggests that for women, the introduction or use of pornography might signal a deeper and more profound weakening of marital attachment, a true tipping point in trust or connection. So the subsequent decision to quit acts as this powerful signal of relational repair, a return to the shared norms of the relationship. For men, who tend to consume in greater amounts and often try to compartmentalize the habit, stopping, while positive, is less statistically predictive of a return to marital happiness or preventing a divorce.
Let's look at the age effect. That has to be critical in an era where digital saturation starts younger and younger.
The age effect is arguably the most alarming finding in the whole study. The association between beginning porn use and divorce is stronger for younger Americans, and it declines steeply with age.
So maturity and, I guess, like having a longer relationship history serve as a protective factor.
It seems so. Sunk investment in a marriage helps.
What are the predicted probabilities for the youngest group, the 20-year-olds who are just building the foundation of their lives?
For a 20-year-old married person who starts consuming porn between survey waves, the predicted probability of getting divorced skyrockets to 51%.
51%.
Compare that to only a 6% predicted probability for a non-user of the same age. You are looking at a system that introduces a catastrophic stressor at the precise moment when the foundational bonds of marriage are supposed to be forming and strengthening. It severely compromises the stability of young marriages.
Okay, but we have to address the common sense argument here. Maybe unhappy people just turn to porn. So the unhappiness predicts the divorce, not the porn itself. How did the study control for initial marital happiness?
The finding on initial happiness completely overturns that common sense assumption. The link between beginning porn use and divorce was actually stronger for those who reported greater initial marital happiness, the very happy group.
Wait, stronger for the happy couples?
Yes. For couples who are initially very happy, beginning porn viewing increased the predicted probability of divorce from 3% for non-users to 12%. For those who were already unhappy, the effect was smaller.
So happiness doesn't protect you. It actually makes you more vulnerable to this specific stressor. Why would that be?
The analysis suggests that for the happiest couples, the introduction or discovery of the habit functions as a catastrophic tipping point. Because the relational foundation was strong, the introduction of what is often seen as a type of infidelity causes a sharper, more immediate decline in happiness and then dissolution. It's a violation of implicit trust that happy marriages are particularly unprepared to absorb.
Okay, finally, let's circle back to Durkheim's observation that religion and community offered a necessary regulatory mechanism that was destroyed by industrialization. Does that moral barrier still offer protection against this digital erosion?
It does. And the finding here is perhaps the most counterintuitive of all. The positive association between beginning porn use and divorce is only significant for those who are less religious.
Really? I would have hypothesized that the most religious people would be more impacted because the social stigma in their community would exacerbate the crisis if the habit was discovered.
The data suggests that the social structure itself is the protective mechanism, not just the moral disapproval. Among weekly religious attendees, there is virtually no difference in divorce probability between those who start watching porn and those who do not.
So the community acts as a buffer.
It suggests the collective social control, the shared commitment to transcendent principles, and the built-in deterrence effects of a strong community-based religious structure serve as a powerful protective barrier against marital dissolution itself, regardless of private consumption habits. The community acts as a powerful force against the final act of atomization, the dissolution of the family.
So this structural erosion in the private sphere, the atomization, the anxiety from digital anomie, the resulting family fragility, this has to feed directly into the hyper-tribal public sphere we discussed earlier.
It has to.
When the family unit and the shared moral vocabulary are gone, anxious, isolated individuals look for external substitutes for belonging and moral release.
They absolutely do. They look for the structure of belonging, innocence, and guilt that the successor ideology provides. And they find it packaged neatly in partisan conflict. This is the final stage of the collapse, the rise of political sectarianism.
Political conflict has always been with us, but this new phenomenon, what researchers call political sectarianism, it suggests the conflict has fundamentally changed its nature. It's not just ideological anymore, it feels existential.
Political sectarianism, as defined by researchers like Finkel and others, is a superordinate construct. It describes the tendency to adopt a moralized identification with one political group against another. And the defining shift is that its foundational metaphor is religion, a schism, not simply policy disagreement or a kinship identity.
It's a holy war of identity.
It is. And this changes the very stakes of elections and governance. And there are three core ingredients of this sectarianism that mirror the structure of religion.
What are they?
The ingredients are othering, aversion, and moralization. First, othering involves viewing opposing partisans as fundamentally alien, as essentially different from you. This creates a powerful mega-identity, where your politics dictates everything you assume about the other side's race, religion, class, and core values.
And the second?
Second is aversion. This is the active, visceral dislike and distrust of opposing partisans. And it's important to note, researchers have found that out-party hate has become a more powerful and reliable predictor of voting behavior than in-party love.
So people aren't voting for something as much as they are voting against the perceived evil of the other side.
Exactly. And the third ingredient, which ties directly back to that moral vacuum created by Anomie, is moralization. This is viewing opposing partisans not just as wrong, but as inherently iniquitous, as morally corrupt or wicked.
So when all three of those converge, any political setback feels like an existential threat that has to be averted at all costs.
Right, which justifies sacrificing long-standing norms.
And what's truly destabilizing about this is the extent to which these moralized perceptions are just fundamentally divorced from reality. We're operating in a massive reality gap.
The perception gap is enormous, and it's systematic. Partisans consistently and vastly overestimate the differences between the two sides. They assume opposing partisans are far more socially distant, contemptuous, and ideologically extreme than they actually are. The conflict is increasingly based on a fictionalized enemy.
Can you give us a sense of the scale of this overestimation? What are the data points from the sources?
The research on this is startling. For example, Republicans, driven by this narrative of othering, estimate that 32% of Democrats are LGBT.
When the reality is?
The reality, based on demographic surveys, is closer to 6%. Conversely, Democrats, fueled by similar distortions, estimate that 38% of Republicans earn over $250,000 per year. The reality is only 2%. So the conflict isn't growing more severe because the policy disagreements are larger. It's growing more severe because the emotional and moralized distance between these fictionalized opponents has become insurmountable.
And the sectarian logic, where identity and moral outrage outweigh policy, it must have fundamentally compromised the core functions of governance and representation.
It has. When political identity is moralized and voters adopt this sectarian mindset, politicians have no incentive to represent all their constituents or seek consensus. They only need to appeal to their mobilized purist base.
You can see that in the street ticket voting numbers.
Absolutely. The correlation between the Democratic share of the House vote and the Democratic share of the presidential vote was 0.54 in the 1970s. By the 2010s, it had surged to 0.94. The system is now structurally rewarding hyper-partisanship over competence or consensus.
And this sectarian logic, it fundamentally incentivizes anti-democratic tactics because the stakes feel so existential. The moralization of politics justifies anything.
It does. When the foundational narrative for so many partisans is that the other side cheats, the moral imperative shifts to self-defense. If the enemy is iniquitous, then our side must sacrifice long-standing democratic norms, whether it's rules on judicial appointments or legislative procedures or even election certification.
Anti-democratic behavior gets justified as necessary moral warfare.
And we saw this entire system stress-tested in real time during the COVID-19 pandemic. A shared external threat completely failed to unify the nation. Instead, it became another partisan symbol.
It was a textbook example of political sectarianism overriding any shared purpose.
It was. Public health measures like mask wearing, stay-at-home orders, vaccinations. They became tied up entirely in identity and moral affiliation rather than scientific consensus. And this partisan schism pushed society toward a lethal and expensive disequilibrium.
We failed to effectively contain the pandemic while also crippling the economic recovery because too many decisions were based on sectarian moral alignment instead of shared public health goals. So, if political sectarianism is the final corrosive fallout of digital anomie and the successor ideology, what are the promising leads for mitigation? How do we rebuild a functional society when the emotional infrastructure is so poisoned?
The strategies focus primarily on challenging the perceptions that fuel the cycle and reducing that moral self-righteousness. The first approach is data-driven, simply correcting those massive misperceptions of the other side.
Closing the reality gap?
Yes. Studies show that when you show people accurate demographic and ideological data about the opposition, it measurably reduces their feelings of sectarian aversion.
So that's managing the facts. What about managing the emotion?
A second promising strategy is instilling intellectual humility. So instead of asking people to justify why they hold a certain policy preference, which just activates the moralizing centers of the brain, you should ask them to explain their policy preferences at a mechanistic level, the how.
Not why, but how.
Right. When people are asked to explain the actual functioning of a flat tax or how a carbon emissions policy would operate in practice, they gain an immediate appreciation for the complexity of the issue. That intellectual difficulty reduces their self-righteousness, and it interrupts the tendency to simplify everything into a moral binary.
That reframes the entire engagement from, am I good or evil, to, do I actually understand this?
Exactly. And finally, we have to return to the digital sphere. The research is clear. Just exposing people to opposing views on social media can actually aggravate sectarianism.
Because it just gives them more opportunity to perform moral outrage.
Exactly. The more promising interventions involve encouraging deliberation about the accuracy and the trustworthiness of claims rather than just the opinion. When users are focused on objective truth, they're less likely to share false or hyper-partisan material. The solution isn't more exposure to the opposition, it's a greater emphasis on objective truth and verifiable claims.
The entire picture that emerges from these sources is one of a deep, systemic ethical contradiction. The public sphere is increasingly defined by this rigid, moralized language and purity tests, the successor ideology, which acts as a functional, adversarial substitute for lost religious frameworks.
While at the same time, the private sphere is stripped of all constraint by the liquid forces of digital technology, leading to deep structural anomie and the quantifiable erosion of core bonds like marriage.
The paradox is that the desire for moral meaning is so strong that when it's evicted from the private, transcendent realm, when families erode and individuals are atomized, it just rushes to fill the political vacuum. This system replaces competence with moral theater, and it turns every political disagreement into an existential conflict.
The clearing of reason shrinks when that deep-seated human need for a moral release valve is filled by horizontal scapegoating against political foes, rather than being contained by transcendent moral principles or the robust social constraints of community. This dual reality, a hyper-moralized public identity and an atomized private life, is creating a profound instability. The ultimate risk is not the ideologies themselves, but the full-on institutional moral theater and horizontal scapegoating that cripples the nation's ability to find consensus and confront challenges, demonstrating the terrifying fragility of a liberal society built on competence when its silent moral foundation finally gives way.